Visa does a lot to work with these providers. And one of the most interesting things that we've announced recently is our Visa Flex Credential, which it's an incredibly intuitive product, right? You can go from debit to credit. And what it really does is you have a single card that if you go into the Klarna or Affirm app, you can actually select whether I'm going to pay for this now with a debit transaction, or you can toggle over to I'm going to pay in installments.
Welcome to the Galileo Financial Technologies Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Henderson. We're here to delve into the thrilling world of fintech and banking, exploring the latest trends, innovations, and disruptions. Every episode features insightful chats with industry leaders and visionaries who are pushing the boundaries of finance and banking. Whether you're passionate about fintech, running a startup, leading a large bank, or just intrigued by financial technology, this podcast is your go-to source for staying ahead. Let's dive into the future of finance and banking together.
Okay, let's get started here. So Kevin, we are here in the afternoon, day one at Fintech NerdCon. So great to see you here.
Exciting.
And I would love to just chat a little bit. I think the theme of my talk today is really going to be evolution. So I would love to see you're at Visa focused in the fintech category, both places that have had a great deal of development and evolution over the past decade or so. I'd love to first just a little bit know about you, how you have evolved your time at Visa, and then we can maybe talk about the fintechs that you work with and then Visa itself. Love to hear a little bit about you and your background for our audience.
Of course. So Kevin Meigs, been at Visa for 11 years. And in that entire time, I've had pretty much the same job. It's just been that fun.
That's the best.
So when I first started at Visa, my first job was actually working with Stripe. It represented a PhD in payments. We really got like our fingernails dirty. It was like their first generation of folks who were building out the pipes for what were a lot of gaps in the ecosystem at the time. And we went brute force, market by market, to get them into different countries, to get them live with a number of Visa products. We launched issuing from the ground up with them. So for me, it represented just a real way of getting my fingernails dirty in the payment space. And so today, fast forward, look after a broad set of fintech partnerships across the ecosystem, whether that's in the consumer space, if you think of the buy now, pay later companies, the digital banks, the crypto players, over to the B2B world and the commerce providers as well. And then we have a BD team that looks after a lot of new startups, that folks that are like companies here at NerdCon. And so that's what our mandate is. And the fintech ecosystem has been basically a source of an engine of growth for Visa. And so that's been the case for the last 10 years, and we anticipate that'll continue to be the case.
Yeah, that's great. It's the little engine that keeps on going. So can you tell me a little bit about fintechs today and what you see when your BD team is talking with them, and maybe contrast that to even 5 years ago, what it means, and both in terms of maybe their preparedness as well as what areas are they tackling?
Yeah, if you think about Visa, we are the original, or the OG fintech. We're like 60 plus years old. And because there's now thousands of parties in the ecosystem, it's somewhat funny to call it the four-party model anymore, right? Yeah. It's almost comical in that there are numerous intermediaries across the entire value chain. But then if you kind of transition over to just what has transpired over the last 5, 10, 15 years in the fintech space overall, I would say so much of the fintech world and its growth and evolution, as you said, comes down to one thing: underserved customers. And you can see this play out in so many different verticals across the ecosystem. We've started thinking about the digital banks who were serving underbanked customers, thinking about credit building, and they were just customers that were overlooked from the legacy banking system. You can go over to the merchant side and you think about a company like Square, who was supporting micro and small merchants in ways that many of the acquirers at the time really overlooked. They didn't think about the hairdressers and the food trucks and the smaller merchant space. And across the other verticals in the merchant world as well, whether it's Stripe themselves, thinking about developers, right? Developers look at Stripe and say, "Oh, someone who gets me," you know.
Exactly.
And then you had Adyen in the enterprise space, who represented a true next-gen platform that could enable enterprise merchants to scale globally, to do it on a single global platform, versus some of the legacy providers who had a conglomerate of different acquisitions. And so it really gave fintech's an advantage in the ecosystem to go after these underserved customers. And just the fact that the legacy providers left these wide gaps that I don't think either they weren't aware of or they didn't have the ability to tackle at the time, you could see this just play out consistently. And now we talk about new types of verticals, whether it's buy now, pay later, or whether it's the crypto space, where it continues down a theme of underserved customers. And so much of that too is triggered by, I think, the other side of the coin, which is infrastructure. I think if you look at the architecture of fintech over the last 15 years, you started with this approach that was very modular. You had a company that would say, we can do KYC really well, and we can do ledgering really well, and we can do compliance really well. And then you had probably the most important partners of all, which is the BIN sponsors, who were willing to go into that kind of model, which was relatively new at the time and still somewhat unique in the US. And you had these modular providers who had API-based infrastructure, who then fast forward, now a lot of that has been wrapped again. So what became modular is now come back to being providers like Galileo and other program managers who can say, we can bring all of those things together for you and help you scale your business. And so that level of architecture created a real powerful and potent ability for customers to take advantage of. And even from a Visa perspective, we've also seen it be built on top of our own infrastructure. So you think of a Marqeta, for example, they took the ISO 8583 message set, wrapped it in modern programming languages like JSON, and then created some really interesting customer experiences. And so we see this play out in a lot of different verticals where Visa wants to continue to work with the types of partners who can build on top of our ecosystem and help grow our network, which is a virtuous cycle when you have more nodes on the network and that network effect, basically.
Yeah, and I think before we were talking a little bit, I was joking around that I've been at 2 out of the 3 networks, and the last one I have not been at is Visa. But I think in the time since earlier in my career were there, and then now with merchants and processors, et cetera, I really do think that Visa has seen the opportunity, right, from maybe being back in the old days, all the networks a little bit more protective about who did you let onto the network and participate, to realizing that really it's multiplicative, right? The more you have your enablers, acquirers, et cetera, the more business there is. And I think that's really I think it's wise, right? Because that's really, I think, where a lot of the growth has come from. Something you talked about really struck with me, which is a lot of the examples that you gave up front were really on the acquiring side. And do you think that the opportunity for new and exciting innovation, those spots to be filled, do you think that is bigger on the acquiring side, and maybe just in the US, maybe not in other markets? But do you think that's really where the expansion has been that fintechs have brought? Do you think the issuing side is as exciting, I guess? So
I think there is room for innovation across the ecosystem. The issuing side, this is what we've been working on for the last 5-10 years, is enabling these digital banks, digital wallets, different types of providers who are thinking about issuing. And so what we've seen a trend develop, back to the point around underserved customers, you have a barbell effect in the issuing space around fintechs either serving those underbanked or unbanked customers who maybe have lower FICO scores, maybe have not been served by traditional banks. On the other side of that barbell is what's going on in the affluent space. So today you see almost a arms race from some of these providers. Think of Robinhood offering 3% cash back across the board. You look at Coinbase, what they're doing, what Crypto.com is doing, and we're just seeing a lot of competition for very high levels of rewards. And they're doing that also to bring in other revenue streams. It's like I mentioned, that virtuous cycle. It allows them to really create an ecosystem for their customers, whether that brings in trading revenue on their crypto platforms or equities platforms or direct deposits. And so these are ways that a lot of these neobanks are really bringing in customers and creating really slick user experiences that ultimately lead to customer choice. You mentioned how Visa thinks about enabling these very different types of partners, and historically, you're right. I think the networks were a little conservative around this, but I think that's just changed over time, and I think it gets back to customer choice, right? And Visa wants to work, with the types of companies that are enabling customer choice. And so that's something that is very embedded in our DNA.
Yeah. I think one thing as you're talking about kind of building on and opening up new markets, one thing that has happened over time is, I'll give the example of Visa Direct, right, which is enabling money movement in different ways overseas, funding cards, pushing cards. What are some other ways that Visa is looking at, really, I'm going to say, across payment types, enabling, I'm going to say, maybe even interoperability besides different types of payment rails? Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you talk about like various payment rails that are out there that are alternatives too. And I'll say again, Visa really promotes the idea of customer choice and interoperability, and preferably both. Because if you have customer choice, I think you also see in like checkout flows that can also backfire a bit. You have the NASCARization of payment buttons, and you have 20 to choose from, and that can create a kind of paralysis of choice for consumers. So you want to make sure that the ecosystem, it has interoperability around certain standards and the ability to create the best possible user experience for consumers, which is exactly what they're demanding. And for us, as we think about what are the next rails, what are the next flows that we want to enable, you're also seeing this play out in now the stablecoin space, where we're thinking very deeply about where the best use cases are for things like that. And then if you, we can certainly talk ad nauseum about what's happening in AI, but it's also an area where we're thinking about what does the transaction need to look like for that's future-proofed for what is going on in the ecosystem. If you think about what's happening in AI, you have to keep your eye on the news every hour for another announcement to come out. And so for us, keeping pace with innovation is mission critical. And if you were to ask, like, what is the thing you like lose sleep over, that would be my thing. Is if we don't, then we risk becoming the company that doesn't serve customers. And that's the legacy issue that we want to avoid. And so by building with partners, by working in this new agentic world that is clearly coming, is not a hype cycle, even if it is a bubble.
Right.
Those are transaction flows that we want to make sure that Visa is very competitive, and Visa is working side by side with some of the most innovative partners in the space.
So maybe because the key buzzword, right, is AI, agentic AI, maybe you can, I'm assuming most of our listeners have probably know something, but assuming that somebody doesn't, they're hearing that term for the first time, can you just define agentic AI? And then from the Visa perspective, like, what are the things that Visa, I'm going to say, worries about in terms of making sure that it works in the network environment?
Yeah. So I think there are a number of ways that agentic commerce can play out over time. I think initially what you're seeing from companies like OpenAI and Stripe and Shopify and others is creating checkout experiences that aren't necessarily an agent buying something on your behalf while you're absent, right? You are there, you're discovering, maybe it's travel, maybe it's a hotel, maybe it's something along those lines, and you have this new way of discovering the best possible purchase for yourself. And so I think what we're seeing is almost like an Apple Pay or a Shop Pay type of transaction embedded in these ecosystems, and how that's evolving. And Visa is playing an active role working directly with these partners like Anthropic and Perplexity and OpenAI and Stripe and others to basically ensure that's the type of transaction flow that's seamless for a customer. You think of the types of problems that can develop over time in this agentic commerce world. Obviously think of things like disputes, like what if the agent buys something on my behalf that I don't want them to buy, and who do I go dispute that to? So Visa's thinking very hard about where do we enable that ecosystem and make sure that the framework is in place for rules and protocols to ensure customers can trust a transaction, and then the merchants can too. If you look at what we've announced with our trusted protocol, it is a merchant, even though it's called trusted agent protocol, it's a merchant-facing solution that says to the merchants, okay, if a bot comes in from OpenAI or from ChatGPT, from an agent that says, we're looking to buy this product, you can ensure that it's a good bot. There's a lot of bad bots out there, and creating this protocol for merchants to be able to trust when and how to approve a transaction is a critical element of this. And then on the flip side of that, we have agent-facing protocols that allow them to build these seamless transaction flows that depend on things like Visa tokenization and authentication, and things that Visa has been trusted in the ecosystem for many years at this point.
Yeah. Are there particular areas where you are seeing either regionally or segments where you're seeing these transactions already gain momentum and volume, or is it still TBD?
I think it's still TBD. I think the consumer-facing space is really what we're seeing originally, right? You go into ChatGPT, you say, find me a flight, right? And whether you're purchasing that flight on an airline's website or an OTA website or in OpenAI, like that's still just buying a flight, right? And so while we certainly want to enable this ecosystem to create these interesting and seamless consumer transactions, we're also thinking about the B2B space. What does the agentic world look like for B2B invoicing in 5 years? So there are new and use cases that can also, we're thinking about how do we grow the ecosystem of issuance and acceptance? How do we grow the network incrementally with true organic trends? And I think you'll start by seeing purchases of consumer goods and experiences, and I think it'll evolve over time to find paths to what's the next transaction set that it'll enable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things come through adoption on the consumer side, right? And then all of a sudden you wonder, why can't it be this easy on the B2B side or the business side, and kind of merge in that direction? Thinking a little bit about the issuing side, can you talk a little bit about things like BNPL and other, I guess, new forms of payment, if you will, or new modalities for consumers or businesses, and then where you think that's going in the future?
Yeah, the rise of BNPL providers has been meteoric, hasn't it? I've seen a bunch of stats recently that said 60% of Coachella tickets last year were purchased with buy now, pay later. And it's not just like Gen Zers who are going 6, 7 and using Klarna. Like you're seeing this play out in other generations too. I think 71% of parents are using buy now, pay later for holiday shopping and back to school shopping. And so the habituation of this payment modality has really created a seamlessness for consumers that's where the demand is. And Visa does a lot to work with these providers. And one of the most interesting things that we've announced recently is our Visa Flex Credential, which it's an incredibly intuitive product, right? You can go from debit to credit. And what it really does is you have a single card that if you go into the Klarna or Affirm app, you can actually select whether I'm going to pay for this now with a debit transaction, or you can toggle over to I'm going to pay in installments. And so it almost becomes, what the ecosystem is talking a lot about, programmable money. That is something that Visa is thinking about and starting to work on and see a ton of traction. Like I think just a few weeks after Klarna launched this card product, they had over 1 million cardholders.
Wow.
So it's just, you can see it grow like gangbusters. And so we're very proud of what those companies are doing, and we want to be part of it.
Before we wrap up, I would love to talk a little bit about any kind of news you could use or advice that you might have for fintechs who have an idea to launch, et cetera. Maybe they've gained some traction. What kind of steps do you think that fintechs need to take in today's world? What advice do you and your teams give them? And we were talking a little bit before about hard to find a bank use cases, et cetera, because I deal with both networks and sponsor banks. That's an area that's near and dear to my heart. Maybe you can share a little bit about how you advise fintechs in their search for a sponsor bank.
Yeah, you're right. And we spend a lot of time with leadership at our sponsor bank partners who are principal members at Visa, and hear directly from them how they think about evaluating risk in their ecosystem and how they've thought about the last few years and what has transpired. And part of what we work on with fintechs is finding a good DNA match for them with the BIN sponsored teams and helping them understand what types of transaction flows are going to be more highly scrutinized. But you're also seeing some interesting innovation too. I think like Erebor, the new company that is just looking to get OCC chartered, they're looking at enabling exactly those types of somewhat higher risk transactions in the crypto space and elsewhere. And so you might start to see competition here for those higher risk flows where they see opportunity. But like I mentioned, finding good, strong DNA matches, that's the case both in the BIN sponsor world and in the processor and program manager world. A lot of clients want to scale globally, and we work closely with you guys like Aleo and a number of other partners to ensure that when fintechs come to us asking for advice, we help them find the right types of partners. And we do it somewhat agnostically, but we also want to ensure that they work with Visa partners that are have the capabilities that they're looking for.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's always the exciting challenge in our space, right? We work with, as a processor, or we work with multiple sponsor banks, multiple networks, and I think it's really trying to understand the client or the prospect, their needs, right? And what's going to be the best match and make a recommendation within that. But at the same time, we all have to be willing. The power of the network, right, is the more participants that we have in it. So there's always that balance, which I think is part of the challenge. What haven't I asked you about that you would like to talk about, or that keeps you up at night, or that you see as a huge opportunity?
Can I flip that over on you? I
Sure.
would love to hear a little bit about what keeps you up at night. I think you guys see a ton of the ecosystem in this space, are doing a lot of interesting things, and are a strong partner to Visa. Would love to hear what's top of mind for you.
I think, and I'll just tell you from my kind of personal view looking out right in the world, first of all, I think that there's so many opportunities, right? The question of where do you invest? And I think this is a question for every company, right? You have ultimately some limit to your resources and you need to prioritize. So where do you put that effort? And then as you see some of the other opportunities go away that you've decided not to, always recalibrating. So I think the choice of where to put resources for development and where those bets are, I think is very important to me, and thinking about that overall.
I'll tell you what, like that is number 1, 2, and 3 on my priority list too. There's a couple, principally, you think about placing bets across the ecosystem. If we were in like 1997, would I have rightly guessed to go invest in Sergey and Larry? Would I rightly guessed to invest in Mark Zuckerberg? I don't know. And so on the one hand, you have the random walk theory down Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, where you have to have
place 20 bets and
you have to have a diversified portfolio.
Exactly.
On the other hand, you need to find the types of customers that are high growth, and I think that comes down to a couple things. One is, obviously, you have the organic trends of technology that kind of prop up certain segments, and so when you think about the verticalization of where to place bets, it could be, right now we're talking AI, we're talking stablecoins, you have the kind of buzzwords of today. And that kind of fits cleanly into a strategy document that you go share internally. What doesn't fit very cleanly is what so much of this comes down to is the right people and the right teams, and placing bets on the types of teams that are super smart people who can pivot their business models based on what's happening in the ecosystem, and finding those folks. And it's not very quantifiable. It really is somewhat subjective and intuitive. And like I said, doesn't always fit cleanly on a strategy document, but is so critical. And so that's where Visa thinks about, is like, how do we find the right types of teams that are growing and have just super bright people? And then making sure that we keep pace with innovation. It's exactly how I'm thinking about it.
The challenge. We were talking, since it is conference season, we were talking about various conferences and where to invest time, et cetera. And the discussion came around to that point, which is part of it is meeting new potential partners, et cetera. But part of it is also relationship building with your existing partners, because that ability to work, you need trust, right? You need familiarity, and you need to be able to have partnerships, right, where you can bring an idea and the other party will respond quickly. When someone's asking you to turn something on a dime, right, you have to have that kind of trust that they're not asking you to do it frivolously. When I look at sponsor banks in particular, because there are a lot of banks entering the space, I do look at who are the people there. I might not know them personally, right, but have they been in the industry? Do they have experience? Does my BD team trust them, et cetera? And so I think with all of the technology and everything else, it still comes down to working with people that you feel bring value and you can trust and you can work well with. And I always think that it's interesting that ultimately that really is an important part of the puzzle. It doesn't go away. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Great. All right. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the conference. Great to have a chance to chat with you and get to know you a little better.
Me too. I know you said that you've been at the other networks, and maybe you could save the best for last.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's been a great joy. I will say, working with the Visa team, we've had a couple of record speed product implementations and so it wasn't due to any bias on my own that I didn't make it to all three, but really enjoy the partnership that we have with Visa.
You too. Thanks so much, Christian.
All right. Talk to you soon.
This podcast has been a production of Galileo Financial Technologies with all rights reserved. The content is provided for informational purposes only and is not legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. We strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information. You understand that any reliance on this information is at your own risk.